Okay, so Trump and Netanyahu unveiled the long-awaited Middle East peace plan, also known as Trump's deal of the century, which makes it sound like a pretty great deal. Which, uh, truth be told, I don't think it's a fantastic deal or anything. But my overall take here, which I've been thinking about this for a long time, ever since the details of this plan started getting leaked, which pretty much have all been leaked at this point. We haven't gotten any official details from Trump, just lots of bluster and things. But I think that this is about the best that the Palestinians could hope for at this point, when it comes to having any semblance of independence from Israel at any point. And I know that there's going to be lots of people who are going to be very mad at me for saying this, because it is true that the fact that this is supported by Netanyahu is enough of an indication that this is a bad deal for the Palestinians. But before I get into that debate or anything, I guess I should go over generally what the plan is. Basically, there would be a so-called state of Palestine that would include Gaza and a lot of the West Bank, sort of bits and pieces, the bits and pieces that Israel hasn't already gobbled up. Essentially, Trump's plan says, hey, Israel de facto has annexed much of the West Bank at this point, even though it's technically not a part of Israel, and it is illegal for Israel to settle and colonize conquered territory based on international law since World War II, and that basically they shouldn't have done that. But it's over. It's happened. And we can't really do anything to change that unless we were to go in and uproot all the Jews who live there now and drive them out and bulldoze all their houses and things. And there's no political support for that in Israel. Israel's holding all the cards militarily. There's no reason that Israel would ever give that up. And so the best that they could really do at this point is sort of freeze the battle lines where they are. Stop the Israelis from encroaching further on Palestinian land, and essentially say, okay, the areas now that the Palestinians are living in, we'll kind of wall that off and give them their official status. And then the Palestinians will have control over that area, and the Israelis will basically keep all of their settlements. And the way that this is going to work is that essentially you're going to have a border, jaggedy little borders around all of these various enclaves everywhere, and each side is going to have roads or bridges or tunnels or whatever going over or under the other side's territory to get between theirs. So the Israelis in the settlements will be completely surrounded by Palestinians, but they'll have a road going back into Israel. And the same thing for the Palestinians that are completely surrounded by Israelis. They will have a road that will get them back to all the other Palestinian territories. So you won't have these enclaves that are completely cut off, like, say, you did in South Africa with the bantustans. Not to spoil things too much, but this plan pretty much is very similar to apartheid. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Obviously, if you want to preserve a separate Palestinian and Israeli identity, you would need to have political separation. They would need to have two separate states. And the way that this was achieved in South Africa through the Bantustans was they essentially took a bunch of, let's take Bapa for the example, because this is the one that was the most egregious, to where Bapa was essentially a peppering across northern South Africa, across much of, I think it was mostly in the Transvaal, but maybe also in the Orange Free State. But it was basically an archipelago where you had these little islands of sovereignty that belonged to Bapa that were completely surrounded, all of them, by South African territory. And so it wasn't a contiguous state. And of course, beyond that, it was pretty much a puppet state of South Africa. Their government was closely aligned with Pretoria. But leaving that aside, they're really, from what I understand, pretty much if you were in Bapa and you wanted to go anywhere else in Bapa other than your little town that you lived in, you had to drive through South Africa to get there. Trump's plan here basically takes that same problem, which any Palestinian state would have at this point, and tries to remedy it by building bridges so that, and roads and things, so that all of the Palestinian and all the Israeli territories are linked to one another, so that they don't have to go through customs or whatever through the other's, state in order to do that. And this is a way of, making the separation more permanent, so that in a practical sense, the Israelis and the Palestinians can go about their lives without having to interact with one another so much. And, the reason why I find this kind of appealing is that I've thought that for a long time we should divide up states this way. I've said that about purple states in America. That we should divide them, between red districts and blue districts, or red counties and blue counties, and just so that you have a more politically homogenous unit. And so what if they don't directly touch each other? That's not such a big deal. And of course, there would be a tunnel going from Gaza to the West Bank itself, and then all the little different, because the West Bank is the one that's really getting chopped up in this plan, because Israel has so many settlements throughout the West Bank, and Israel would end up in this plan coming away with a huge chunk of the West Bank if you put together all these little strips of territory that Israel has cut out of it. It looks like it's been shaved into ribbons. But, like I said, thanks to these roads, the whole thing could be linked together and essentially stitched together, kind of like a quilt, or perhaps like a Frankenstein monster. And so that, in my opinion, is not the problem with the plan. The exact, the practicality of having essentially a Palestinian archipelago is not the big problem here. The problem, of course, comes in the reason why you have this archipelago, because Israel essentially has gotten to annex much of what the Palestinians would consider a part of their core homeland. And of course, there's very little support within amongst Palestinians for cutting up their whole, what they consider to be their country. They consider, the way they look at it is, very quite rightly, that Israel is just occupying their land and that Israel should leave and let them go about their business. And so in order to agree to Trump's plan here, the Palestinians would have to acknowledge that all of these territories that Israel has gobbled up and put their people on, that now that those are part of Israel, and that they always will be a part of Israel. And that certainly would be crossing a red line for, I would think, at least 70% of the Palestinian people. But, the fact of the matter is that over the 20th and 21st century, Israel has, in practice, gobbled up much of the territory that these Palestinians and their ancestors lived on. And there's no real way for them to get it back. The fact is that the Palestinians have been losing the demographics game because Israel has been promoting mass migration of Jewish people to Israel, and Israel's a pretty small country officially, and so they've had to send a lot of their new immigrants into these West Bank settlements because they need Lebensraum. And I believe that there's more, if you add up all of, the populations of Israel and the Palestinian territories, Jewish people are a minority, in the whole region there. I'm sorry, they are a majority. There's more, there's more Jews than there are Arabs, let alone, especially when you break it down into Muslims and Christians, there's certainly more Jews. And so, without, having to do reverse kind of ethnic cleansing, cleanse out these new people who have sort of colonized the area, which would be very difficult since there are so many of them, I don't see how the Palestinians could ever get any of that lost territory back. I look at that as something that is lost forever. And that is tough. I think it would be very tough for any Palestinian to accept that. I think it would be humiliating. But I think it's just a fact at this point. And frankly, we saw that there have been other leaders amongst the Palestinians who have come to a similar conclusion in the past. When, of course, Yasser Arafat decided to accept that Israel could keep all of the territory other than the West Bank and Gaza. Because, of course, prior to that, the Palestinians had been pushing to have a Palestinian state in the shape and the form laid out by the UN partition plan, which, of course, was much larger than just the West Bank and Gaza. And there were other Palestinians who were a little more demanding and wanted a much bigger state, because the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of Palestinians who are living outside of Israel and the Palestinian territories in refugee camps still, who are, now descendants, no longer really, you don't really have the original people who were ethnically cleansed during al-Nakba, but you have people who lived in what is now Israel. And they wanted to go back to their hometowns, which were destroyed by Israel. And Yasser Arafat, who is considered by a lot of Palestinians to essentially become controlled opposition, said, you know what, I would be happy with just the West Bank and Gaza. But they didn't even give him that. Israel kept pushing, and they kept, they had a lot of settlements actually in Gaza until the last few years. They pulled out of Gaza and essentially let Gaza become this, sort of island of anarchy. Of course, anarchy is the wrong word. It's more like an open air prison where all the guards are on the outside and they just sort of shoot inward to discipline the prisoners. There are no real prisoners inside, there's no prison guards on the inside. It's almost like a big cattle ranch full of Arabs. And then on the other side, you have the West Bank, which Israel has over the years continually encroached upon and put more of their people in, trying, with the obvious goal of eventually annexing the entire West Bank, which I think there's no doubt that Israel will do if there's not some kind of concrete final settlement put in place, if there's not, say, a final solution to the Arab question, to use more stark terms. And so basically, I agree with the Palestinians that Israel is not exactly offering them a great deal. But the fact of the matter is that they don't have a great bargaining position. The Palestinians, they haven't been able to achieve much, despite what they want. Israel is the one holding all the cards now. And, so if they want any semblance of independence, this is what they have to take. Now, of course, there's also the side of sort of a newer generation of Palestinians that have given up on the idea of statehood, and they would just rather have equal rights as Israeli citizens. And they want to just be treated like every other, they want to have the same rights as Jews, because they recognize, hey, we're under Israeli domination right now. We might as well accept that we're a part of Israel, but we want to have constitutional legal rights. And so that'd be another reason to oppose this. And that's actually, I think that it's much more smart to oppose this plan for that reason than it is to oppose it with the hopes that you're going to be able to get a bigger Palestinian state down the road. I don't think that and by the way, I should reiterate, because I talked about comparing this to a bantustan earlier. This is absolutely a bantustan. It's actually I shouldn't say that. I think it's worse than a bantustan. It's more of an Indian reservation, because bantustans, at least, they had their own, despite being South African puppet states, like members of the Eastern Bloc were, Soviet puppet states. The bantustans were, to a certain extent, sovereign. They did have their own militaries and their own borders. It just so happened that the government that controlled those militaries and those borders were aligned with the South African government. But they were not, legally speaking, a part of South Africa. The whole policy of apartheid was to create separate states for each nationality within what was the former Union of South Africa, to essentially disunite South Africa. That was the whole project of apartheid. But this project here, the Vision for Peace, as the Trump administration is calling it, is doing something different. They're not really creating a Palestinian state. They're creating a Palestinian reservation within Israel, because all of the external affairs of this so-called Palestinian state will be controlled by Israel. So they're not really a state. They are a territory of Israel that has some modicum of self-government. Or at least in theory, because we haven't seen any sort of potential constitution unveiled yet. But it seems clear that this territory will not have its own military. It probably will have its own police, and it will not have control over its own borders. Now, this map released by the Trump administration shows that they do have port access, which is interesting, but port access is not the same as having border control. There's no... I guess we can assume that these would be free ports, that they wouldn't be subjected to Israeli customs, maybe. But we don't even know that much. And so, in essence, what I'm getting from this plan is that this is not a plan for the independence of Palestine or something like that. This is a plan to officially end the Israeli military occupation of the Palestinian territories and move towards a kinder, gentler form of Israeli domination. So this very clearly would still have, Israel playing the leading role, and the Palestinians would be sort of a junior nation, so to speak, kind of like Israel's Canada. Now, with all that said, for the reasons that I discussed earlier, it seems pretty clear that there is no support amongst the Palestinians for this. The somewhat official Palestinian, I guess the Palestinian National Authority is what they're called now, who, sidebar, are also considered by many to be sort of controlled opposition for Israel. I guess it's, what's that guy's name? The leader of Fatah. Mahmoud Abbas, I think that's who I'm trying to think of. I believe him and his folks have denounced this and said that they're threatening to pull out of the Oslo Accords, which, again, the Oslo Accords don't really give them much power anyway, so what's the point in staying in? But they are taking more the line of, well, we want to hold out for a bigger territory, which I just don't think that they're ever going to get. And frankly, so if I were in their position, I don't know, because I'm not a Palestinian, but I know that what they think, what the PL or what the PA, the Palestinian Authority's stance on this is incorrect, is strategically a bad idea. No matter whether you support having a somewhat of a Palestinian statehood, or whether you just want to have equal rights within Israel, what Abbas is saying is, and their folks wanting to hold out for a bigger state, I think is just asinine. And so, if you are a Palestinian, I can understand having either of those positions. I have no idea what I would support if I were in their position. It may very well be that at this point I would think that it would be better just to have, try to work towards having equal rights on par with the Jewish population. But at the same time, this, deal is being put before you. So maybe it would be better just to take it and to try and see however many rights you can try and extract from this. Because at the very least, I think that this is better than the status quo, and it would be something a little more concrete. I think that once this is laid down in paper, and once they actually draw out a map where there are, semi-official borders, even if they aren't really national borders in the same sense, it becomes a lot more difficult for the Israelis to keep moving people in and trying to annex more territory. If it's very clear on the map, which side is which. But in the end, this is all really theoretical, posturing on my part. It doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, if there was any chance of this deal actually going through and for it, to benefit the Palestinians, like I said at the beginning, Netanyahu wouldn't have supported it, and neither, probably would his opponent Benny Gantz. Both of the, men who have the potential to become the next prime minister of Israel support this deal, and I think the only reason why they do is because they know that it won't go anymore, that the Palestinians would never accept it. So even if it's a little more generous than they would like, they are able to support it because they know that it won't go anywhere. And so this just serves as another feather in their cap, so that they can point in the future and say, look, this is another example where we tried to give the Palestinians a really great deal, and they just didn't want peace. They just wanted to keep fighting us because they're a bunch of dirty terrorists. That really seems to be what this is all about to me. And so if you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.